Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special session with the Ladies Study Group in Kolkata today. Our event is titled The Power of One, and I honestly believe that there could not be a more perfect fit to this title than my guest for today, Ms. Shobna Bhartia. We all know her credentials. Yes, she is the chairperson and editorial director of the Hindustan Times Group. And yes, she is a Padma Shri recipient, along with a host of other felicitations. And yes, she has been on the Forbes list of the 100 most powerful women in the world and been a member of our Rajya Sabha for 6 years. But there is so much more to her. Known for her grit and her determination, she is always perfectly poised and graceful, and she can hold her own intellectually within any group, both national and international. And she has the rare combination of an Indian woman professional, an international standard manager, and a news executive with a clear sense of mission, all rolled into one. And so, without wasting any more time, let me invite to our screens the First Lady of Indian Media, Ms. Shobna Bhartia, who is joining us from Delhi today. Good evening, Shobna ji.
Good
And
evening, Dia. Thank you.
thank you so much for your time today. We are all so excited and we are so looking forward to this interaction with you. And personally, I want to add that it is such an honor and a privilege for me to share the screen with you today. And I wish it could have been in a physical format. But
I
since
know
we
we are
are
going
in
through these
Kolkata,
challenging times.
crazy times, crazy
Yeah.
times. But since we are in Kolkata, and this is the city where you were born and brought up, in what we can call the royalty of corporate India, what are your memories of that time? I know you were much younger than your siblings, so possibly grew up like a single child. I think by the time you were 12 years old, both your elder siblings were married too. So do tell us what that was like.
Yeah, I have very fond memories of Calcutta, and Calcutta is home, even though I've spent much more of my life in Delhi. But Calcutta still retains a very special part for me because that's where my family lived. My parents were there, my siblings were there, and a lot of my childhood memories and the happy occasions, the birth of both my children, my education. I was married in Calcutta. But having said that, there's actually my entire professional life picks up after I came to Delhi. So
Today.
it kind of has just, segmented my life. Calcutta life was all very personal and lovely memories, childhood memories. And those are always very nice. They are never bittersweet. And then Delhi for me was a turning point because I came to the city and very soon I started working. And it was a totally different world. Calcutta just brings back memories of growing up in a very, very vastly joint family kind of a scenario. Though our core family was my two siblings and my parents, but we were a much larger joint family in every sense of the word, as most Calcutta families are, or rather were at one point. And as you rightly said, that there was quite an age difference between me and my sisters. So they got married when I was fairly young. So even though I did have sisters, but they were married, so I was kind of alone at home, growing up in a home where my father traveled a lot, didn't spend much time in Calcutta. And as and when he came, the conversations and the topic of discussions were always very much more to do with public life because he traveled a lot. He had a very keen interest. So, to that extent, I kind of grew up partially like a only child. But on the other hand, as I told you, that we were a larger joint family, and I had cousins the same age as me, so that was nice. Always growing up with that feeling of somebody around you, your age. And very soon after I got married and had my children, I moved to Delhi. So then all my professional memories are sort of created really out of Delhi and not Calcutta. So maybe in a way that's why I love Calcutta even more, because I can go back and think of Calcutta without any issues, without any problems. And the memories are all of a very personal nature.
And we had a beautiful jewelry store also named after you over here, which I think was shut. I think that was started
Yes.
by your father, right?
I think COVID's taken its toll.
Told, that's true. So
Yeah.
you moved to Delhi,
Challenge.
or you rather started working when you were 29 years old. And
That's
I have
right.
three parts to my question at that point because it was a very different time. We were in the 80s. And at that time, a woman from a conservative Marwari family going into work, that must have been a challenge. So that was one part of my question. And the second part about it was also joining the workforce at Hindustan Times because so far they had not had anybody from the family there. They were used to their bosses being in Calcutta. Now suddenly they had this young girl from the family who was going to be their boss. And thirdly, how did your father view it once you joined work and you started giving him your suggestions? Because I know it was one of the many businesses he had, and it was more, I think, a passion, I think you've said somewhere. So these are the three things I wanted to understand when you're only 29. What was it like for you?
Okay, so to deal with your first part, as I told you that I was in Delhi and not in Calcutta, so I wasn't there to sort of first-hand receive the uh, backlash, comments, or people's kind of levels of surprise as to how and why a woman was actually joining a family business, which was largely much more a male bastion.
True.
It all started with, as I told you, that I had siblings, but they were older to me. They got married when I was relatively young. So I kind of grew up in an environment and atmosphere where we were discussing politics, public life, business to some extent, because the dining table conversations veered around that. So I think from an early age, I had quite a lot of interest in public life. And when I moved to Delhi, I kind of started taking an interest purely as a reader as far as the Hindustan Times was concerned. My father, meanwhile, had kind of decided that his business was going to go to his three daughters. And therefore, as far as Hindustan Times was concerned, he felt that I was perhaps kind of an obvious fit for that and started involving me. It did actually meet with many raised eyebrows as to,
Yeah,
uh,
sure.
his overall decision, not me with Hindustan Times, but the overall decision that his companies would be looked after by his daughters and that the family businesses would be given to daughters because it was not necessarily something that was being practiced across the community that we belong to. It did meet with its own bits of surprise, but I was in Delhi. As far as work was concerned, I think there were fewer women who were actually working in the media at that stage. So there were two issues. One was, as you said, that my father was the chairman of the company, but also the chairman of several other businesses. Wasn't taking any day-to-day interest in the running of the Hindustan Times, but more of a overview off and on. So to have somebody from the family who is pretty much going to be over there all the time, then somebody who age-wise didn't make the cut, then somebody who possibly for many gender-wise never made the cut. So I won't mislead you and say that things were easy. Things were not. Things were much easier in terms of the acceptance of my father's decision. So back home in Calcutta. But then the hard realities of actually going to work every day where people thought that perhaps you were coming more as some kind of a pastime and you would get bored and you would then decide that you're going to move on or you're going to be irregular. I also had young children at that time, and so there were a lot of questions about the seriousness. My father, also understanding that, actually never pivoted me into any position of entitlement or authority. So, to begin with, I spent many, many years in the Hindustan Times just getting trained, like any other intern or any other person who actually had no clue about the business would get trained. So I spent equal time in various departments. Some of them I found extremely boring because my passion was more journalism, was more public life. But I spent a lot of time going through supply chain, media marketing, circulation, and so on and so forth. And it's only after going through the entire chain of the various functions that I started looking after the Sunday section of the Hindustan Times in a more keener manner, in a more sort of a hands-on manner. So yes, I did face with some resistance, but that was also many, many, many years ago, if I may
Yes,
say
sir.
so, several decades ago. And the overall attitude towards women working was not what it is today. So there were challenges, but there were also many who were very receptive. There were many people who were extremely helpful. And looking back, I don't have any regrets.
And I also think it's important to tell our viewers just now that the Sunday edition that you worked in the magazine section was not like the Sunday magazine today, which is with fashion and beauty. It was a very serious political edition. Am I right? The
That's
Sunday
right.
magazine that you
Yes.
started with. Yes.
Yes. Well,
That
it
was
was
a
not necessarily political, but it was a serious magazine and it was very
serious magazine.
featureish. So
Correct.
there could be a political topic also covered, but in a much more long form, featureish manner. Or it
Okay.
could be arts and craft, or it could be women's issues, or so on and so forth. So it was like a small microcosm of a much larger magazine that you may buy on the stand, but because it didn't have the same level of pagination, it was a more truncated form of any other general interest magazine.
Okay. So then, how did you decide to go to Washington? That was a very, very interesting move for someone so young, all on your own. And I want to say to all our viewers that while you were in Washington, I know you were with Catherine Graham. And I know that Catherine Graham was no ordinary woman. Apart from being the head of the Washington Post, she was also the one critical for the Watergate story, which made a US president have to leave his office. So you really picked, I think, the best of the best at that time. So can you tell us about that experience?
So as I told you that, I was put through training, and it's not as if I went knowing anything or knowing everything. And I had to learn, but there was a certain amount of resistance, as I mentioned. There
Yes.
was a certain amount of skepticism. To add to that, the media was seen much more as a cause than a very structured, organized industry. And therefore, there were no standard SOPs over there. There were no kind of do's and don'ts and form. It kind of just evolved. Most of the media companies were all family run, promoter run, and basically they were run in a way which perhaps did not conform to the so-called international standards. Partly because there was very limited option in India, there were very few media professionals. I felt if I have to educate myself and understand and then see where we were relative to what international publications were doing, relative to where international media houses were, I had no clue who to learn from. And so I thought that I should look overseas and try and go to one of the larger, more credible media companies. And I wrote to the Washington Post, and I don't know why, what made me write to Mrs. Graham, because uh, it wasn't as if I knew her. But nonetheless, I reached out to her, and I was very surprised to get a response. And I was given an appointment, which is again after about a month or two. So I made this trip to Washington, and I had asked her if I could come meet her and if it was possible for me to have a very, very brief kind of like an internship, not over months, but maybe over a week, 10 days, and understand some of the functions. I went with a list of a lot of the questions that I had. And when I went to meet her, I was quite nervous because it wasn't as I was immersed in the media and I was experienced, and therefore I didn't even know what the intelligent questions are going to be. But I just felt that rather than getting somebody like a consultant or somebody like a mentor to teach me in India, there were no media professionals. So it was better to go and try and meet with somebody. And I thought she would hand me over to somebody who'd sit with me over 7, 8 days and try and make me understand the more professional basics, because media was treated in a very ad hoc manner. And it wasn't like the industries that you see today, where if you want to get into any sector, there's enough domain knowledge that you can simply get. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But that wasn't the case with the media industry. So, anyway, I went to meet her, and I was very fortunate that we kind of hit it off straight away. And she put me at ease because, as you said, I was just 28, 29. I was very nervous when I actually landed in Washington. And she put me at ease in no time at all. I think she had also gone through a similar sort of a situation where I wanted to be in the media and I opted for it, but she was pushed into it because of the tragic demise of both her husband and her father. So she had enough skeptics also frowning upon her, wondering how would a woman actually occupy that position. So I think she felt I could relate to her, and she made me feel much at ease. And after that, I spent about a week, 10 days at the post, sitting with the heads of various departments, trying to understand how things were really done, and trying to then benchmark it when I came back home with the way we did it, and whether there was any scope for us to adapt and try and go forward in a more structured manner. So that was the starting of a long relationship. And after that, each time we redesigned the Hindustan Times, the executive director of the Washington Post, who was head of design, would come over. Catherine would send him over. He would come and stay in India and spend weeks in India, almost 2 months at a stretch. And we would pay him for his actuals. She always sent him, and it's he who helped us redesign our paper from the late 90s onwards. So the new, more modern, crisp design, a more linear design that you started seeing in the Hindustan Times was one of the fallouts of that association.
That was it. Okay. Okay. So I think it's important to say here that in a career spanning 3 decades, and I think much of it in leadership roles, Shobnaji has transformed HT Media from a print only traditional media company into a professionally run media conglomerate that spans English with the Hindustan Times and the Mint, Hindi with the Hindustan, the digital platform, and FM radio. And I think the HT newsroom today is amongst the largest integrated newsrooms of its kind in the country. And the company's publications, Hindustan Times and Mint, and the Hindustan together, have a readership of 5.94 crores and counting. And your digital portals have over a million users, all unique with all the platforms together. So I want to ask you, in your role as chairperson and as leader of the Hindustan Times Group, what are the different challenges that you face with respect to price and distribution? Possibly you had to focus more on the management side. So can you share some challenges on the management side?
Well, I actually focus more on the editorial side.
Editorial side. Okay.
Yes, that's really my passion. But
Yeah,
yes, the challenges are there on the management side.
management side
You
too,
spoke
yes.
about distribution and you spoke about price. Yes,
Correct,
Indian
correct,
newspapers
correct.
are perhaps the cheapest in the world. And it's a very, very
Yes,
price sensitive product. And if you change the price even by 50 paisa, you suddenly see a drop in your circulation. I think for far too long, it's been subsidized by advertisements and not by the cover price. And readers are used to getting 2 or 3 newspapers at home. So their monthly bill goes up the moment you start adding price, even if it's a rupee more for a newspaper. So it's a very price sensitive product, but with that, we are trying to give you the best quality of journalism. And therefore, the entire economics of newspapers in India is actually vastly different to what I see with all the other media organizations across the globe, even in the Eastern countries. So, whether you talk about Singapore or Thailand, the model is vastly different. Newspapers are paid for by their cover price, so the readers are happy to pay for the content that they get. But sadly, that doesn't happen here. Also, I think there's such a huge disparity in India in terms of the socio-economic categories. And newspapers is something that goes to every category. So if you actually try and see the distribution, say in the Hindi heartland or the vernacular belt of other regional language newspapers, English newspapers, it's very, very price sensitive. And you're dealing with just so many different socioeconomic categories and demographies that it's very, very price sensitive. And the distribution, of course, is fully managed by the vendors, which is again all-time first because all over the world people subscribe to newspapers. Every publisher has a name of all the subscribers to his product and his publication or her publication. But in India, we are all dependent on vendors who are pretty much people who do other jobs by day, but in the morning they act as part-time vendors for newspapers. So they pick up the newspaper at 5:36, they finish distributing them. The names and people to whom they are distributed are not really shared with the media organizations, which puts us in a bit of a backseat when it comes to doing direct marketing. And vendors have very strong lobbies and very strong groups all across India. Papers have over the years tried to change that, tried direct distribution, but that hasn't really been a reality. So those challenges remain. But more and more people are moving to, e-papers, to digital formats, to online consumption of content. So that would over time make this model slightly less meaningful. We are fortunate that in India we are still seeing growth and we still have
yes.
a very significant section of our content being consumed through the through the typical model of papers, but that is bound to change. And it has started changing more so in COVID. There've been
Correct, correct.
there's been
Yes.
a lot of sort of people are scared. I don't blame them. People are worried, and therefore they don't want anyone stepping into their boundaries. So RWAs or people who are in multi-story departments, they don't let the vendor come. They don't let distribution happen, and they are worried that you're having a new person enter. You've got somebody coming to drop a parcel, drop newspapers. So that has impacted circulation as well.
So you've had to reassess your whole strategy and you've had to go back to the drawing board. And have you had to make some changes also because of this?
Yes, we had to make changes. We had to reassess the strategy, and seeing the change in consumption in media, by and large, we realized that when we come back, we're not going to come back exactly where we were. So it's in a sense been good for us. It's propelled us a little faster into a more aggressive online strategy than perhaps one that we would have deployed if all this had not happened, because we still had a lot of life left in the conservative medium. And we knew that eventually the benchmarks were moving towards a much more robust online offering only, but we were trying to leverage print as well. But technology has actually been deployed, and we've changed our model much faster than we thought we would because of the changed circumstances.
So, like you said, you enjoyed the editorial part more. What is the biggest editorial challenge that you faced so far?
The editorial challenge that we really face, and I face, and not only me but publishers all over, is really the whole barrage of disinformation that comes your way, and
Yes.
how do we as a publication, the challenge is speaking truth to power, where governments have the resources, deep resources, to control the narrative. So there's one narrative that is being spun out, whichever is a more convenient narrative that a state wants to put out. It's actually completely changed news cycles. There used to be typical news cycles by which we would assess news, and the audiences also speak back to you in real time. So for any news and every news item, you're getting audience feedback by the minute. You're getting conflicting versions. The state has its own narrative, and the social media has so much of information, disinformation. How do you sift fact from fiction? And the challenge is that what do you put out? How do you ascertain your facts? And we've had so many glaring examples, in fact, in the last maybe month or 2 months, that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So if you pick up the Hathras girls case, the debate continued well into 3 or 4 days whether she was assaulted because there was a family rivalry or whether she was raped. And there were different versions going around. There's been no eyewitness, so therefore, how do you decide what to report? Or pick up the
Right.
Sushant Singh Rajput case.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
suddenly it was made out that it was a murder. It was earlier stated that it was a case of suicide. So you see, there's just such a barrage of disinformation. And when you've got your audiences speaking back to you in real time, taking a position on everything that a brand puts out, what a brand stands for, it becomes a huge editorial challenge for you to weigh in all the pros and cons and come to an informed opinion. Because at the end of the day, what do I have? It's the integrity and it's the credibility of a brand, because technology has made content available to everyone. With a flick of a button, you can go, you can Google, you can get any news that you want. You don't have to watch
True.
television. You just go to YouTube, and if you haven't seen the last presidential debate, just type it out. Doesn't matter whether you go to CNN, doesn't matter whether you go to established Fox News or whether you go to any other random person who may have taped it. So news is it's such a commodity, it's so easily available. And therefore, it's the credibility of the brand, it's the integrity which stands you apart, which then
Yeah.
becomes your future business model. And therefore, it's extremely important to be able to sift facts from fiction and disinformation, and that becomes a huge challenge. And that's a daily challenge, so it's not something that is over. That's a challenge you're faced with every single time.
Very true.
So you have your filters, but in spite of your filters, there are counter narratives coming. And therefore, as a publisher, when I was asked also very often socially, sometimes friends ask you, they feel that, okay, you're a publisher, so maybe you have the last word as far as the truth is concerned. And the honest answer is that you don't, because you're not an eyewitness. So was he murdered or did he commit suicide? The jury may be out on it and the matter is in court. But I'm just throwing that out as an example, that these are the kind of challenges. What I'm talking about was a very high profile case. But there are
Yes.
several other cases that we confront on a daily basis from different areas, from different spheres, across editions, something that may not make national news. It may make important news to one of my editions in Bihar or one of the editions we run in Uttarakhand or UP. So there's this challenge on a daily basis that have you gone drawn into the disinformation? There's also a whole
Absolutely.
thing which is a very conscious attempt to create a false narrative on the social media.
Yes.
Hashtags are created, all kinds of positions are stated, all kinds of polarization happens. How do you retain the integrity? How do you sift that, and how do you present your content, your news without the bias using these filters? Is, to my mind, not only the greatest challenge for me, it is for me, but I think a challenge for all of organized media. I
Very
mean,
true.
all across
Very
the world, it's the biggest challenge for organized media, and that's the reason why very often people will say, "Okay, I want to go if it's American elections." You'll purposely want to search maybe a New York Times, or if you're looking at Brexit, you'll have a particular title that you want to go to because you don't know otherwise how to be discerning, and
yeah.
that
I think
really remains a huge challenge.
I think especially in the lockdown, I think now we're all, we can't go out in the evenings, we can't socialize. So I think every evening we watch our televisions, we have these six, seven boxes with people screaming every night, and there's no content, there's no verification, we don't know what's right and wrong. So I think you're so right about it. I think media needs a lot more maturity, right, to what they're telling us all and sharing with the public at large. So how do you
Well,
verify? What is the process of verification that you all are using at HT?
it's quite a stringent process in terms of all the checks and balances, getting the information, seeing whether there was an eyewitness, getting the source of information, where does it come from, how do you cross check, who are the concerned interested parties in the information, have you given them a right to reply, have you given them a right to their response, and the filters of experience and benchmarking the context. So at the end of the day, in spite of all the filters, it remains a subjective exercise. It
Yeah.
remains a very subjective exercise.
I'm sure. How do you control if a journalist is getting a little out of hand, like a wayward journalist who's trying to pursue his own agenda? So then, what do you do with someone like that?
Well, there are layers, so everyone has a reporting structure. So a
Structure. Okay.
journalist would typically report to whosoever heads the bureau that the journalist belongs to, whether it's a business bureau or a city bureau or a political bureau. And so it's a kind of a pyramid, and that then goes up to a person who's, again, even more senior, the person who's rewriting the copy, who can kind of question the copy that's come, if the copy is kind of using adjectives which leads to polarization or to sort of any sort of hurting any sentiments. And then you have, even in the regional editions, you have local resident editors who would be flagged if there was anything which is a little contentious. So there are these layers that protect you. But having said that, things do slip in off and on. And the only thing is that once it's happened, you take corrective action. But as I said, that it's not like a assembly of a car or some other manufacturing product where you've got all your specifications and it's the same product that you produce day after day. News is so dynamic that my challenges today may be very vastly different to the challenges tomorrow. So therefore, there are errors. They do slip in off and on, and you put out a correction, you put out a clarification, and you see what has been tampered with in the process. I mean, somewhere the process has some loop has been missed. So you try and identify and plug that.
And I know at HT you're very particular, and if there has been any error, then you always carry the rejoinder with as much prominence, which I think is amazing.
Oh,
You're
always, yeah.
very
And
particular,
I
I
do
believe,
that.
about
I
that.
also do that to kind of send a signal that you don't get
Yeah.
away with, any
Correct.
kind of
Correct.
sort of character slaying, any kind of reporting, and feel that your correction will be in a smaller font, tucked away somewhere inside where nobody can read it, where the damage has been
True.
done with prominence in another place. So I always carry clarifications in a prominent manner because I think that forces us also into a certain kind of discipline, and it then compels the entire organization, including those who file the story, also to realize that it doesn't feel so good the next day when your story is being contradicted.
True. Very well said. So this is now the I think the digital age, and I think HT is totally multi-dimensional and one of the most prominent. But with the advent of all the new forms of media and tweets which are flying around the world in seconds, how have you adapted to this changing media consumption? And do you feel that Twitter trends really dictate and determine the headlines today?
They do to a great
They do.
extent because, uh, I mean, Twitter is being used by everyone, bypassing traditional forms of media, bypassing traditional forms of communication.
Very true.
And so, whether it's our prime minister, whether it's other heads of state, they respond to each other, they acknowledge each other's achievements, congratulations. So, for instance, when the prime minister got a second term and Prime Minister Modi got a second term, most of the congratulations all came on Twitter.
On Twitter.
And his
Okay.
responses to the people who congratulated him were also on Twitter.
And I
And
think he
when the
also
prime minister,
invited. I think he also invited President Obama on Twitter for Republic Day. Am I right? For one of the
he did,
Republic Day
and President Obama also responded. And more
on Twitter.
importantly, when Prime Minister Modi, in his first tenure, had gone to Afghanistan, and on the way back, he decided to take a detour and come via Pakistan. Now, that was big news as far as India is concerned. He announced
Yeah.
that on Twitter. So
Okay.
Twitter broke that news. So obviously, we have to, everyone follows. I mean, you have to follow Twitter A for any news breaks, but you also follow Twitter to see what's trending, what are people talking about, what are the conversations about. And it gives you an idea also of to what your audiences are really looking at, what they're consuming, what are the topics that are actually creating or generating more interest. And it's an indication about the appetite, the likes of your audiences. So Twitter has come to play a very, very important part in the entire media discourse.
I think even when 2611 happened, I think the first photographs that we saw, the first visuals we got were from
Yes,
citizen
yes,
journalists on Twitter.
yes,
So
yes.
it just shows how. Do
So
you
that's why
tweet?
Twitter, social media has made it a great leveler because your
Correct.
audiences, your consumers are participating. They're joining the conversation along with you. So you had, for instance, going back to PM's second term when he won, and then he was congratulated on Twitter, and then you had enough people with their own opinions also join the conversation.
True.
So it's
True.
a it's a very it democratizes the entire discourse because say Abe is talking to PM Modi and you can join in and add your two penny bit for whatever you want. So in a sense, it's very interesting, and it makes news kind of accessible and lets everyone have a say. Their opinion gets reflected. So it has changed the way in which we actually uh, consume media. It has changed the way in which we have to scan Twitter very, very closely because many news breaks are happening there.
And do you tweet yourself?
No, I don't. I
No.
follow Twitter through another name, but I don't tweet myself.
Okay, so you don't tweet
We
yourself.
have a
Okay.
HT handle, but
Okay.
not a
Okay.
personal one.
So you have, I believe, every morning a whole lot of newspapers on your desk. How has your own consumption of media changed in the recent past?
By recent, you mean COVID or just general? I mean,
Just generally, I mean, well, now COVID is, I think, the way forward anyway for all of us. For a while now, it's going to be
yeah.
like this. So, do you
So
still go
pretty
through a whole
much,
lot of papers?
yeah, it's pretty much consuming all the papers because I enjoy that. Also, that's part of my job as editorial director to be sort of more on top of it in terms of the depiction by various papers, maybe of the same event, whether we could have done it better, whether we've accurately. Whether we've captured all the important points that need to be captured. More importantly, I think also to see the kind of to keep an eye on the style of writing, the form of journalism, and I actively follow the social media because that's where your leads come from, and
True.
nobody has the time to now wait for the next day to actually you consume media on the go. So whether it's the HT website, whether it's the app, whether it's the app of other international publications, so I think media consumption is happening a lot through our mobiles. You start the day, for me, I start the day with my newspaper because I have to say it's a habit I love. I love getting up in the morning. I love sitting with all the newspapers around me with a cup of coffee. And even though I have them all, perhaps I can read them on my iPad, I don't enjoy it as much as I do actually picking up a newspaper. But then after that, through the day, you're consuming media on the go. So whether it's notifications, whether it's going into various websites, and constantly checking for the Twitter trends. TV channels, as you said, have become a bit of a headache, barring a few.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
yes,
I know. Yes. We have spoken about that elephant in the room. Yes.
yeah.
So I wanted to know a little bit about your career with the Rajya Sabha. And I wanted to just share with those of us who don't know about this detail that from the time of independence, your family has had a very close association with the Nehru Gandhi family. And I believe Mahatma Gandhi ji used to stay in your Delhi home during the country's freedom struggle. And the Indian independence struggle meetings used to happen in your Delhi home. And in fact, I think the first editor of your paper was Mahatma Gandhi ji's son. So, can you share a little more light on that relationship, and then we'll discuss a little bit about your experience with the Parliament.
Yeah, so as you said, my grandfather was a close associate of Gandhi, and the Hindustan Times was started by a group of Akalis, a firebrand group of Akalis who started the paper for India's freedom struggle. And they then went away to Canada. They couldn't support the paper, so they were constantly in need of money. So my grandfather came in, and Madan Mohan Malviya actually stepped in and said he would take over the Hindustan Times. So Madan Mohan Malviya came in and started running the Hindustan Times, but ran short of funding the paper because papers even those days weren't very lucrative. And my grandfather, G.D. Birla, started supporting Mohanji with funds for the first year or two. After which it was quite obvious that it was going to be a loss-making enterprise, and therefore he sold it to my grandfather. And my father got involved with the paper somewhere in the early 1930s, and from then on became quite actively involved with it. So that being the history of the paper, there was a very strong relationship with Mahatma Gandhi. He used to live in our house both in Bombay and in Delhi whenever he visited these two cities, and so a lot of the meetings, a lot of the movements and all were kind of originated with meetings happening over there. And that was the association. In fact, Gandhiji was also shot dead in our property when he was there for his morning walk. That happened in Birla House as well. So that was the association with Mahatma Gandhi. The son, his Mahatma Gandhi's son was the first editor of the paper. And the raison d'etre of the paper really was to be a vehicle, a tool for India's freedom. And therefore, everything that it espoused at that time, because the other titles that were around in India, whether it was a Statesman or the Times of India, all had British origins. And therefore, the Hindustan Times, in a sense, became a very critical voice for India's freedom and the Indian point of view. Gandhiji's son was the editor, and Gandhiji and many other leaders, Patel, very often wrote articles in the paper with their own name, but very often under pseudonyms because they were in and out of jail, and they were writing articles which perhaps they were not supposed to write at that time. So many of these articles were carried under pseudonyms. And that actually started the association of Hindustan Times with the Congress. And the challenge actually came post-independence, when India had won its independence and the paper no longer needed to be like that voice for the Indian Congress Party, which was the leading party that took up independence. So then the paper had to kind of find a new voice and refocus and find its own groove after that.
Okay, that's such a fascinating insight into, I think, a part of Indian history too. So you spent 6 years in Parliament as a Rajya Sabha member. What was that experience like? I don't, without crossing any of the protocols that you need to observe, do tell us something about that phase of your life. Was it possible to really make a change as an MP? Because you spoke on many subjects I know, like internal security, the budget, women's related issues, energy, and power. So, what was the most important to you, closest to your
It
heart?
was a wonderful experience for me. It was a hugely humbling experience for me as well, because the wealth of knowledge that you see there, the diversity, people actually coming from different walks of life. So it was a very enriching example, and some amazing debates. But if you ask me candidly, whether a single member of parliament can make a difference, I would actually like to say that I wish that were true, but it's not true. Parliament's become very kind of controlled, in a sense, over the last many years by the governments of the day. And I was an independent nominated MP. I did not belong to a political party, but the president nominates 12 members to the Raj Sabha on the basis of different disciplines. I was one of those who had been nominated by the President of India. So in any case, nominated MPs don't belong to any political parties, and therefore you can make an impact, but you can't make a huge difference, because difference actually happens when governments and oppositions come together to adopt a proposition and come together to design policy, to design a framework. So I wouldn't say that an individual MP really makes a difference unless the member of parliament happens to be from the ruling party or happens to be empowered by holding a position or a designation. But it does actually open your horizons to just so many aspects that otherwise one would never be privy to. So it was a very meaningful part in my life. It was something that I thoroughly enjoyed. The second ever conviction, or rather of a Supreme Court judge, also happened at the same time. But I wouldn't say that, there would be any lasting change because of the interventions, that also of a nominated member of parliament.
That's it. And Parliament, I think, in India is still largely dominated by male representatives. And it's unfortunate because it's such an important area of policy. And I think in a country like ours, where we account for 50% of the population, but our representation, I think, is only 12%, which is well below the global average of 24%. How do you think we can effect a change in this?
So the representation is only 12%. The representation is a little more, I think, in the Raj Sabha. But, eventually it has to be, again, it's a long process. It has to be, again, by changing mindsets. People spoke a lot about the women's reservation bill. I have never been a votary of that. Strangely, being a woman, I have not been a great advocate. I don't think the answer really lies in going in for reservation. It actually lies much more in education. I think if you educate the girl child more and you allow a person to take their own decision, whether they want to be in public life, whether they want to be in policy making or not, and it also means that we need to change the mindset of people around, because if you look at the statistics in terms of women candidates, in terms of their position within parties, we haven't changed that much. True. We still have high numbers of rape happening in this country. We still have a lot of atrocities heaped upon women. So a lot of that will change when we change the attitudes, not just of lawmakers, but of people in general. People, you, me, everyone in general.
Everyone, absolutely. So how do you think women's organizations like Ladies Study Group, and there are so many of us now in India, what do you think we could actually do, Is there any suggestion you have that we could actually do something lucrative and sensible rather than just, giving a voice, putting your action where your words are? What could we do on that level?
Actually, I think you are giving a voice to women. You're providing a platform for women to come up. So when we talk about education, you're obviously taking it to the level after that. You're allowing women to go for what is their inner call. You're allowing women to actually maybe look out for what their dreams would be. You're providing them with that platform. And it's only once a woman feels empowered and feels that she has a collective strength around her that she then goes on and takes it to the other level. So whether you're starting an enterprise, whether you're getting into any professional line, it's a platform that's offered to you. And you have enough women now who actually are, you spoke about parliament, who are actually also vying for tickets in parliament. It's, there's a huge discrepancy if you actually look at how many women are in parliament. You just spoke about 10-12% versus how many get the ticket. So every party, when they're giving the tickets, talk about how over 30% have been given, 40% have been given. But it's not that constituencies are reserved. So it's not that if there's a constituency, say Bardwan, that all the candidates from every party are women. No. But each party is giving tickets to at least 30-40% women. But then at the end of the day, I think somewhere male candidates, and that has come out and that's been borne out by several surveys, do retain an edge both in terms of the money power that they can hustle, in terms of their ability to actually work the election and their ability to actually win the election, and which is where the changes need to come.
Very true. Very, very true. So, I mean, we all are what we are because of our parents. And so, I wanted to ask you, both your parents did a lot of work in the area of public service and welfare. What are the values that you've imbibed from them in this area, and how do you continue their legacy?
Well, the values, I guess, they get ingrained in you at some level, or at least
Yes.
I hope they do. My father and my grandfather, they always laid a lot of emphasis in terms of philanthropic work. People are talking a lot about philanthropy nowadays. Last 10, 20 years, it's become like something that everyone wants to resort to. But even 40, 50 years ago, a lot of philanthropy was undertaken by the family, whether it was in terms of hospitals or schools or dharamshalas or providing education to the underprivileged. So I think that exposure just helps you becoming more, having more empathy, and I do run some charitable dispensaries. I have been running for many decades now in certain villages. I have adopted a few villages, so I think that's something that continues and carries on. I think each one does it in their own way.
Yeah, yes, of course, of course. And before I hand it over to my vice president, I had one more last question. What is your vision for Hindustan Times? Where would you like to see it go?
I'd like it to remain where it was in terms of the credibility that it enjoyed, and that was the basis of the Hindustan Times. So, as I told you, that you know, digitization has completely changed. Technology has actually changed the way in which we work, and
Yes.
therefore, going forward, I don't think Hindustan Times would, after a decade, be known as a newspaper, but it should be known as a credible media organization. And I think then you become platform agnostic. So whether that content is served to you as a consumer of that content on the go, on your mobile through a notification, or you choose to go to YouTube because you want to see some event, or you're getting the paper in the morning, or you're getting breaks through our radio station. So basically, I would want to see Hindustan Times as a credible media brand, not confining it to being a newspaper or a radio station, but really being a content hub. And that's the kind of brand identity, and that is the identity even today. But more and more, I see the lines that are dividing the various mediums getting blurred, and technology actually dissolving those lines. So the day
Very
won't be far off when you don't want to go to a television, you don't want to put on your TV, because with all the videos that are online, cord cutters, you don't really need to go there. You can just
yes.
type in whatever you want, whatever incident you want to look at, and see where it comes up. So the entire challenge is to actually move out of being a credible, sound newspaper into being just a media brand. And when you've had many successes in the brand as it is today, which is print, it takes a lot to move people out of that mindset, both internally in terms of the people who work with you, because they still think of themselves a lot as people working in the print medium. And your habits have to change. If you're working in a
Yes.
24-hour medium, your habits change. There's no longer the kind of schedules that you had, where we would plan the paper, put it to bed in the evening. You have to think. In fact, the most active time, even today, the most active time for us in the last, I would say, 5-6 years, is really between 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. in the morning. And
Okay.
that's how shifts have changed, because that's the time when the highest online consumption happens. And you're actually catering to people even internationally, Indians living in the United States, Indians who are in Europe. And so you have to put out your news early in the morning for it to catch the news cycles. So it's completely
Absolutely.
changed the way in which we work. So I would really want Hindustan Times to be known as just a very strong media brand that stands apart from others in terms of its integrity and credibility, especially in an era when you don't know what is fake news and what is genuine news.
Absolutely. And I'm sure it's going to happen. I think innovation and adaptability is what comes through from the way you speak. And I think with those, nothing can stop Hindustan Times. So I'm going to invite my Vice President to join us, Ms. Sumita Roy. Can you please join us on screen?
Yes, I'm there. Very enlightening and reassuring discussion. And
Thank
I'm
you.
reminded of the Hollywood movie Post, where the main character, Meryl Streep, conveys the essence of journalism. You, as the chairperson of Hindustan Times, stress on the content, which is much appreciated. Now, I'll take up one question from a member. When do you expect Hindustan Times to be behind a paywall?
Very soon. Very soon. We are working towards that. And very soon going forward, work for that has already started. But when I say it will be behind a paywall, I don't mean that the entire product will be behind a paywall. It will be a more layered approach, a bit like what you see in the New York Times, where a certain amount of content would be free. The website, of course, would be accessible to everyone, but you'd have to pay for more detailed content. You'd have to pay for more long form journalism, more analytical journalism, more data journalism. But you would still get a good section of content for free. So, work has started on that, and I hope to see it soon. Of course, COVID has been a bit of a dampener because everyone's working from home, but I'm sure it'll be behind us, and I hope to see that soon. But as I said, it's going to be partial pay.
Thank you. That's really the way forward. There is one more very interesting question from a member out of plenty of questions that have come. You are an epitome of fashion and elegance. Who has influenced you?
I find this a difficult question to answer. I think everyone just evolves what gives them happiness and what you think comes naturally to you. I think if you
Thank
try
you.
and be somebody you're not, or you try and copy somebody very often it doesn't go down very well with you. So it has to really just reflect who you are. I feel there's no good or bad fashion or good or bad. It's all what gives you happiness.
Thank you so much. We have to, because of constraint of time, I'll hand over to Dia now.
Okay. Thank you, Sumita Di. So, a couple of more questions since we have, I think, another 3 minutes to go. So, I wanted to ask you, what is your advice to a young person who wants to set up a media house? Is there space or is it already a saturated market?
It depends what a person would want to do. It is quite saturated, I have to be honest. And even when people go for all these new online magazines and all, you need to be able to market them, you need to be able to amplify your content there. So it depends. You have to identify the target audience that you have in mind and the kind of niche that you want to occupy. So if you feel there's scope for, say, a publication targeting a particular area that nobody has looked at, so I think there is a lot of scope in that. Like there's some people who've come out with amazing ventures in the last 4 or 5 years, basically towards the agri community. It's giving farmers all kinds of information. It was a very small startup, and they're doing exceedingly well. Everyone, you see farmers having it all on their mobile phones, gives them information, climate, pesticides, sowing seasons, other issues, markets. So if you have an idea and the idea looks at a segment that has been hitherto ignored, you have a lot of scope in that. So, but for that, you need to have the imagination, you need to know what's your target audience. If you want to try and be just a general media play, then it requires a long time.
And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this. How do you balance your professional life and your personal life? Because I know you feel that they're both equally important. And the second part of the same question, you and Mr. Bhartia run two extremely successful companies. So, do you seek professional advice from each other? What are the dinner table conversations like at home on a regular basis?
Never about work.
Never about
We don't
work.
want fireworks at home. Never about work.
Never about work.
Never
Okay.
about work. No.
And how do you balance your professional and your personal life?
Yeah, so there I think that's something that my father's basically drilled into me. I'm very punctual by nature, and I'm a little anal about time management, and everything is slotted. Sometimes my family also tells me that even the time I spend with them is slotted, but be as that may, that's the way I am now. My father was like that, and I think that actually helps me put in a lot. And we always say, oh, the day only has 24 hours. How much time do I have? But you'll be surprised if you plan your day better. You can do all and more. And I haven't sacrificed
Absolutely.
anything. I enjoy time with my family. I enjoy time with friends. And I love my work. But the whole thing is that I try and slot in everything. And I'm super punctual. And that helps me hugely.
I know, and I know our slot is done for today, and I know how punctual you are. So I'm going to respect that. So I'm going to let you go. And thank you so much for this session today. I think we have all seen and heard today from you firsthand how you are a leader who has transcended all barriers and myths and shown us that there is no substitute for consistent hard work. The power of one lies in a vision and the goals one sets to realize that vision. It lies in the ability to delegate with conviction and trust and to accept success along with failure. And I truly believe you, Shobnaji, are the epitome of this power of one. And as you continue to mold the opinions of the world's largest democracy, I am sure you have motivated all our audience today, and that includes me, to chase our dreams and goals with a fresh energy and passion. I wish you and all my viewers today the very best as we enter the festive season. Shubha Bajoya to you and to all my members too. Stay safe, everyone, and we will meet soon again on our next webinar virtually to celebrate the festive season together. And thank you so much, Shobnaji, once again.
Thank you, Dia. It's been a pleasure being with the Lady
It's been
Study
a
Group.
real
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you for your time. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.